One of the great challenges that we're facing is the unbelievable faith that people have in institutions or people who that carry some type of a label, where they literally have faith in what these people say or what these institutions say more than the faith that a religious man has in God. It would seem sometimes. Um, and here is a beautiful example of it. I have had many conversations with people. I remember a good friend of mine, an educated person, a doctor, and he once told me, that the UN ambassador said this. I said, so the UN ambassador said that. They can't be wrong, but he had blind faith in what this person said, and there was no way to have a conversation. This is the issue with having the corrupt UN putting out statements and information which is false because people believe it blindly. This is a very important conversation that's very critical for all of us to watch. And this is with Melanie Phillips on Israel State of the Nation. She's a journalist, and she's discussing this with the host.
Phillips, welcome to the State of the Nation podcast.
Hello, Eylon. Thank you very much for having me on.
When the Sky interviewer is saying, Hamas told me this, and the UN says the same thing, and a whole alphabet soup of human rights organizations say the same thing, and it's my word as a government spokesman against half of the world, I think viewers know which side they're taking. That makes my job all the more difficult. And I'm wondering what it is that we don't understand about the starting point with which British or American audiences think about the conflict, about why these organizations that purport to be humanitarian are essentially running interference for Hamas. What do we not understand about how people outside Israel are viewing this conflict?
In Britain, there is absolutely zero appreciation that they're running interference for Hamas. In Britain,
they don't understand the way that all these UN agencies are running interference for Hamas.
If you're a decent, Christian, God-fearing individual who's pretty apolitical but has a conscience, and you pass the Oxfam shop, you get the Amnesty International begging bowl in the street, you give. Because it's for good cause, because it's for Palestinians, and it's for humanitarian purposes. There is zero understanding of the way in which the whole humanitarian industry of NGOs, charities, the major charities, plus the whole apparatus of human rights law and all the rest of it, has been co-opted completely.
How did that happen? Why have these organizations been co-opted in a way that in this war they are essentially interfering to try to save Hamas's skin after the October 7 massacre and make sure that this war ends with Hamas still on its feet? Because that would be the logical conclusion of anyone who is trying to demand that this war end with anything other than a total Israeli victory.
Well, I think there are a lot of components for that, and I wouldn't claim to know all of them at all. First of all, a number of them are under the umbrella of the UN. It is a major international world misapprehension that a transnational body like the UN, which is supposed to be promoting peace and justice, does that because it's a transnational body.
I see the UN spoken of with so much moral reverence. It's the United Nations has said.
Because there's a whole orthodoxy in the West that transnational bodies basically promote the brotherhood of man.
By their nature.
Because they're transnational bodies, whereas nations are only interested in their own self-interest and aggression. People don't understand that if you have a transnational body which represents most of the countries of the world, given that most of the countries of the world do not observe human rights.
Oh yes, they're not exactly liberal democracies, most of the countries in the world, are
so
they?
If you have a bunch of kleptocracies, dictatorships, tyrannies and rogue states all getting together, i.e. the UN, it is not surprising that they preside over not peace and justice, but the opposite. So all that infrastructure of humanitarian aid, or humanitarian groups, not all, but a significant proportion, is going to be devoted to advancing the interests of people who are hostile to democracy, hostile to human rights, hostile to the Jewish people, hostile to the state of Israel. Nobody in Britain understands that because they're fed all the time by the consensus which says you can't trust governments, any government. You can't trust politicians, any politicians. You certainly can't trust the government.
Spokespeople.
You can't trust the government of Israel because everybody knows that if it wasn't for Netanyahu and his right-wing consensus, his right-wing coalition, there'll be peace tomorrow. Right. So you can't trust any of these, authorities. What can you trust? You trust people who are not government. You trust people who are motivated by compassion. They are backed by the churches. They are backed by the sainted United Nations. They're backed by sainted people. They are sainted people.
Fascinating. And that causes us so much grief because we find that Hamas has been using UNRWA, which is effectively, it is a Hamas front. It is the international branch of the Palestinian nationalist movement, using it not only to store tunnel shafts and weapons in their facilities, but also to launder its information for global consumption. Because Hamas claims something, UNRWA then will put it out in a press release with a blue UN logo. And the next thing we know, the International Court of Justice is quoting an UNRWA allegation, and then it's not Hamas saying, it's not UNRWA saying it, it's the International Court of Justice, and it's causing us very serious problems.
I think it's extremely difficult for the vast majority of people to get their head around this. I mean, it's a terrible thing that we're all facing here, where you have an international establishment ostensibly devoted to peace and justice and humanitarian and compassionate concerns, which is entirely...
Which are very noble values. And it would be wonderful if the UN did live up to that very lofty mission.
This is the terrible thing. You have the most noble values which have been turned inside out. And, with the best will in the world, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to convince people of that. But you certainly can't begin to expect people to begin to understand that unless you start telling them.
This is the reason why it is so valuable that President Trump is pulling out of parts of the UN and hopefully will stop funding them and weaken them. They are a very central part of the problem. People just quote them blindly as if they are truth when they are the lie itself. This is why UNRWA is so dangerous and why Israel, they've outlawed them, but they haven't actually stopped them. And they are still operating. And they must be stopped immediately because, when you look at a problem, you have to see the roots of the problem. And one of the roots of the problem that we are having because of the West's beliefs are the statements coming out of institutions like this, which has led, as he pointed out, to the ICC. And this is just perpetuates itself. And we can cut it at its feet, and we must do that immediately.